Imagine waking up before sunrise. No alarm, no phone, no coffee, just the sound of the Nile and the knowledge that if you do not work today, you do not eat. That was the daily reality for millions of people who lived inside one of the greatest civilizations ever built. We talk about ancient Egypt all the time, the pyramids, the pharaohs, the golden masks, but we almost never talk about the people who actually lived there, the farmers, the bakers, the scribes, the mothers, the soldiers, the children. What did they eat for breakfast? What did they wear? What did they fear? What made them laugh? Ancient Egypt lasted for over 3,000 years. 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, more time passed between the construction of the Great Pyramid and the reign of Cleopatra than between Cleopatra and us today. This civilization was not a moment in history. It was history. And for most of that time, ordinary life was stranger, harder, funnier, and more human than anything you have ever seen in a Hollywood movie. This is what life was actually like in ancient Egypt. Let us start with the basics. Where did people live, and who were they? The vast majority of ancient Egyptians were not pharaohs. They were not priests. They were not warriors in golden armor. They were farmers. About 80 to 90% of the entire population worked the land. Egypt was an agricultural civilization built entirely around one thing, the Nile River. Every year, the Nile flooded. When the waters receded, they left behind a rich black layer of silt that made the soil almost impossibly fertile. The Egyptians called this land Kemet, meaning the black land. Everything outside of it, the desert, they called Deshret, the red land. Life happened on the black, death waited on the red. A farmer in ancient Egypt did not own his land outright in the modern sense. The land ultimately belonged to the pharaoh, the divine ruler who stood between the gods and the people. In exchange for farming it, you paid taxes and grain, and if the flood failed, if the Nile ran too low or too high, you were in serious trouble. Historian Toby Wilkinson, writing in The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt, describes how dependent the entire civilization was on this annual flood. One bad flood cycle could collapse entire communities. The Nile gave everything, and the Nile could take everything back. Most Egyptian families lived in small mud brick houses clustered in villages along the riverbanks. These houses were simple but smart. Thick walls kept the interior cool during the brutal daytime heat. Small high windows let in air but kept out direct sun. Rooftops were used constantly, for sleeping in summer, for drying food, for socializing in the cooler evenings. The average home had 2 or 3 rooms. A main room for eating and working, a back room for sleeping, sometimes a small courtyard with a simple mud oven and a few animals. Inside, furniture was minimal. Reed mats on the floor, clay pots for storing grain, oil, and water, a wooden chest if you were lucky. The wealthy had actual beds raised off the ground. Most people slept on mats or low wooden platforms. There were no mattresses. There were headrests, curved wooden supports that held your neck off the sleeping surface. These were considered a sign of status. The more ornate your headrest, the better your position in society. Now let us talk about food, because this is where ancient Egypt surprises almost everyone. Egyptians ate well. By ancient standards, remarkably well. The foundation of the diet was bread and beer, not luxury items, staples, daily necessities that every Egyptian consumed, regardless of class. Archaeologists have found evidence of dozens of different types of bread at Egyptian sites, made from emmer wheat and barley, baked in conical clay molds, flavored with dates, honey, garlic, or herbs. Aidan Dodson, an Egyptologist at the University of Bristol, notes that bread was so central to Egyptian culture that the word for food in the ancient Egyptian language was literally the same word as bread. The beer was thick, nutritious, and low in alcohol by modern standards. It was not recreational drinking. It was nutrition. Workers building temples and monuments were paid partly in beer rations. Children drank it. Elderly people drank it. Everyone drank it because it was safer than untreated river water and packed with calories. Beyond bread and beer, the Egyptian diet included onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, cucumbers, figs, dates, pomegranates, grapes, and fish from the Nile. The Nile was an extraordinary food source. Catfish, tilapia, perch, and dozens of other species could be caught in abundance. Meat, meaning cattle, goat, or sheep, was reserved for wealthier households and religious festivals. For most people, fish was the main protein source. Poultry, especially geese and ducks, was also consumed. Eggs were common. Here is a counterintuitive fact that many people find shocking. In terms of caloric intake and dietary variety, an average ancient Egyptian farmer may have eaten better than a poor European peasant living 2,000 years later in medieval times. The Nile's fertility and Egypt's agricultural organization created something rare in the ancient world: relative food security for the common population, at least during good flood years. Now let us talk about what Egyptians actually looked like day to day. Not the ceremonial images carved into temple walls. Real people going about real lives. Clothing was practical and simple. Linen was the material of Egypt. Made from flax plants that grew along the Nile, linen was lightweight, breathable, and washable. For most working men, this meant a simple white kilt wrapped around the waist, tied or belted, existed. For women, a close-fitting white linen dress, sometimes with straps, sometimes sleeveless. For children, often nothing at all during the hot months. Linen was bleached white. Colored fabric existed but was associated with higher status or specific roles. Personal grooming was taken seriously. Egyptians of all classes shaved their heads or kept their hair very short to avoid heat and lice. Wigs were worn for formal occasions and could be elaborate. Both men and women wore kohl eyeliner, the dark lines you see on all ancient Egyptian depictions. This was not purely cosmetic. Kohl, made from galena or soot, had genuine practical effects. It reduced glare from the desert sun, similar to how athletes paint black stripes under their eyes today. It also had mild antimicrobial properties, offering limited protection against eye infections in a dusty, sandy environment. They used perfumed oils extensively. Body odor in the desert heat was a real problem. Scented oils made from castor, sesame, moringa, or imported cedar were rubbed into the skin and hair. The wealthier you were, the more expensive your oil. Children in ancient Egypt had a distinct and somewhat surprising childhood by modern standards. Young children of both sexes often had a distinctive hairstyle called the sidelock of youth, a single braid or lock of hair left on an otherwise shaved head, usually on the right side. It was a visual marker of childhood. Once you reached puberty and the lock was cut, you were considered an adult. Children played. We know this because archaeologists have found toys. Wooden pull toys in the shape of animals with moving jaws and limbs, clay balls, painted spinning tops, dolls made of wood and linen with real hair. Board games were enormous. The game of Senet, one of the oldest board games in human history, was played by everyone from pharaohs to farmers. It involved throwing sticks like dice and moving pieces across a 30-square board. It was also deeply tied to ideas about the journey through the afterlife. Playing Senet was, in a small way, rehearsing your own death. Death was never far from the Egyptian mind. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Egyptian culture. We tend to think the Egyptians were obsessed with death. That is not quite right. They were obsessed with life, specifically with making sure life continued after death. The mummies, the pyramids, the elaborate burial rites, they were all expressions of a deep hunger to keep living. The afterlife, called the Aru, or the Field of Reeds, was imagined as a perfect version of Egypt. Fertile land, the Nile, cool breezes, your family, your animals, your home. It was not a spiritual abstraction. It was a continuation. For ordinary Egyptians, elaborate mummification was expensive and out of reach for most of history. The full process, removing organs, using natron salts, wrapping in linen, could take 70 days and enormous resources. Common people were buried more simply, wrapped in linen, placed in the desert sand with a few personal possessions. The dry desert sand actually preserved many of these bodies naturally. Some of the best preserved ancient Egyptian mummies in existence were never formally mummified at all. The desert did the work. Religion was not separate from daily life in ancient Egypt. It was daily life. The gods were present everywhere. Ra, the sun god, moved across the sky every day. Osiris ruled the dead. Hathor governed love, beauty, and music. Thoth kept the records of everything. Prayers were said in the morning. Amulets were worn on the body. Small household shrines held clay figurines of gods and ancestors. When a woman wanted to conceive a child, she prayed to Hathor. When a farmer planted his crop, he prayed to Osiris. When a scribe began a document, he invoked Thoth. Healers combined medicine with ritual. Egyptian medical knowledge was, by ancient standards, genuinely impressive. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical document dating to around 1550 BCE, contains over 700 remedies for conditions ranging from infections to skin diseases to mental illness. Egyptian doctors understood basic anatomy, could set bones, perform some surgical procedures, and treat wounds with honey, a substance now known to have real antibacterial properties. But treatment also involved spells, incantations, and offerings to the gods. The rational and the magical were not in opposition, they were partners. Women in ancient Egypt held a legal status that would not be seen again in much of the world for thousands of years. Egyptian women could own property, inherit land, make contracts, sue in court, and even run businesses. They could divorce their husbands and were legally entitled to a share of the household goods. They were not equal in every sense. Most positions of major political power were held by men, but compared to women in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, or medieval Europe, Egyptian women had remarkable freedoms. Hatshepsut, one of the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history, ruled for over 20 years. She was not an anomaly in a culture that could not imagine female power. She was an expression of a culture where female power, though unusual, was possible. Life for an ancient Egyptian was hard. The work was physical and relentless. Medical care had real limits. Childhood mortality was high. The average life expectancy, based on skeletal analysis done by bioarchaeologist Pia Beneki and others working on Egyptian remains, was probably somewhere between 30 and 40 years, though many individuals certainly lived much longer. The desert sun damaged skin and eyes. Grain grinding wore down teeth at an accelerated accelerated rate. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease carried by Nile snails, was widespread and debilitating. And yet, inside this hard life was music, dancing, humor, love, sport, and beauty. Egyptians held festivals that could last for days. They wrestled, swam, rowed boats, and held archery competitions. They wrote love poems. We have them. Papyri from the New Kingdom period contain lyrics that sound startlingly modern: longing, jealousy, the nervousness of approaching someone you love, the joy of being loved back. They made jokes. We have those too. The oldest known joke in recorded human history may be Egyptian. Workers at Deir el Medina, the village of artisans who built the Valley of the King's Tombs, left behind graffiti, complaints about supervisors, records of who was absent from work and why. One man recorded being absent because he was brewing beer. Another was away because he was bitten by a scorpion. These are real records. Real people, annoyed, tired, occasionally drunk, just trying to get through the week. They were, in every way that matters, completely human. The next time you see a photograph of the Great Pyramid, or a golden mask in a museum, or an image of a pharaoh carved into stone, remember this: behind all of that grandeur were millions of ordinary people waking up before sunrise, eating their bread, drinking their beer, arguing with their neighbors, playing board games about death, and hoping the Nile would be kind again this year. 3,000 years of civilization built not by gods, by farmers who got up before the sun every single morning and decided to keep going.